idea that the military is the sort of single and most effective reform program for boys is just completely untrue. It often just leaves them more damaged.
Welcome to the Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Vermont journalist Jasper Craven has spent a decade investigating and exposing the culture of toxic masculinity that has raged just out of sight within the American military. In 2018, he authored a multipart exposé for VTDigger about sexual assault and abuse in the Vermont Air National Guard that resulted in hearings at the Vermont Statehouse, reforms in the Guard, and the retirement of the adjutant general in the wake of his reporting. His writing on the military and veterans has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, Politico, and Mother Jones, among other places. Craven, who is 33, has a new book, God Forgives, Brothers Don't: The Long March of Military Education and the Making of American Manhood. He argues that the U.S. military shapes American masculinity, especially through its military schools, academies, and programs such as Junior ROTC in middle and high schools and ROTC in colleges. But the form of violent masculinity that these institutions advance have taken a heavy toll, as evidenced by a suicide crisis throughout the military. Jasper Craven is a policy fellow at the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute and a reporting fellow at Type Investigations. Last year, he was recognized by the National Press Foundation with their inaugural award for excellence in coverage of veterans. Craven grew up in Vermont, the son of renowned filmmakers Jay Craven and Bess O'Brien, and is moving back to Vermont this summer to continue his work in journalism. Jasper Craven, welcome back to the Vermont Conversation.
Thanks for having me, David.
Well, congratulations. I think this is the actual publication day of God Forgives, Brothers Don't. So I want to back up a little to talk about how you got here and how you connect your upbringing in the Northeast Kingdom and the family that you grew up with having had for a number of years running now a focus on the military.
Yeah, well, as some may know, my father, Jay Craven, was a prominent anti-war activist during Vietnam before he moved to Vermont and became an artist. And so dinner table talk often ended up in the sort of fraught days of that conflict. And I learned a lot from my dad um, about sort of how the Pentagon operated and, was able to understand this sort of pretty profound moral degradation that occurred in that era and really has sort of continued apace ever since. My dad also did a good job of making clear, which, sometimes the movement didn't always succeed at, that there was sort of this elite officer class, the commander in chief, et cetera, devising and propagating these conflicts. And then there were all the service members of many backgrounds with many dreams, ambitions, hopes that became inevitably caught up in it. And so I long was fascinated by the military from those conversations. My mother, I should also say, is a documentary filmmaker, and early in my childhood, I would accompany her to shoots and just really watch and learn how to engage in sort of deep, sometimes uncomfortable conversations, interviews about hopes, dreams, struggles that her subjects were facing. So perhaps it's no surprise from these two people that I ended up becoming a journalist with a focus on military and veterans issues. add to that the fact that when I was first getting my start in Vermont at VTDigger and the Times Argus, Bernie Sanders was chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. So I sort of had this, that sort of fortified my understanding of veteran life and um, created a certain righteous anger with sort of what was happening. And so despite my sort of frustration with much of what the military does, I wasn't totally able to trace that culture or sort of understand, this vast institution's imprint on individuals until I got a tip about 5 years ago that Valley Forge Military Academy, um, a historic institution that has reared many generations of young men, was in deep trouble and had a sort of mutating, really pretty severe culture of hazing and abuse. And so it was from there that I first was able to sort of see how military culture operated in a new way and how really since America's foundation, it's influenced American boys and men.
So I want to take it back a little further than that tip because some Vermonters may be familiar with your work as a reporter on a searing 2018 investigation that you did for Vermont Digger into the toxic culture in the Vermont National Guard, which was really an extraordinary piece of work that resulted in a lot of change. Talk about what you found right here in Vermont.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because that was another sort of critical experience in my life that illuminated for the first time, toxic elements within military culture. You know, the Vermont National Guard uh, has a long and proud history. I would argue that few other states are perhaps as fond of the Guard as Vermont is. The Green Mountain Boys, Ethan Allen, this deep history that connects us to our independent spirit, and sort of ambition and all of the rest. And so and I harbored fond sort of feelings about the Green Mountain Boys myself. Um, but as you referenced, I received a tip in 2017, I believe, that the Air Guard um, was basically complicated, corrupted by this sort of Top Gun fraternity style culture, in which the sort of the deep and sort of uh, unceasing public acclaim had gotten to the heads of some of the airmen leading the Guard and resulted in uh, a sense of ego and impunity and misogyny among senior Vermont Guard officials. Famously, one senior pilot took a fighter jet from Vermont through a snowstorm for a romantic rendezvous with a woman he was not married to, um, which cost a lot of taxpayer dollars, and I think typified a sort of uncontrolled, misogynistic, sexualized culture, that was fortified by drinking and initiation rites and all of the rest. So that you're right. I mean, that was very foundational to me because all of a sudden this vaunted institution that I was familiar with from childhood was exposed to me as a lot more complicated and flawed than I think I and many Vermonters could have imagined. And certainly that, I mean, that was my first experience reporting on military sexual trauma and military sexual assault. And I came to understand how, you know, the military holds unique elements that can make these problems worse than in civilian life, and also that many of these systems developed to combat that behavior are themselves flawed and easily exploited, and can leave women in particular really feeling betrayed by an institution that they've given their lives to. And so that was a real wake up call that definitely motivated me moving forward.
Can you just say briefly what some of the things you found going on in terms of military sexual assault and harassment right here in Vermont?
Yeah, well, there were a number of stories of women who had really for decades been passed over for promotions because for whatever reason they weren't deemed loyal enough to the senior men in charge, or, you know, to be blunt, didn't flirt with them or sort of entertain their sexual advances. Some women alleged that female coworkers engaged in sexual activity with senior military officers for promotional purposes, essentially. Um, there was a military chaplain at the Guard who allegedly preyed upon a female Guard member for a long time. There were, you know, countless alleged epithets of intoxicated airmen, you know, objectifying women, making inappropriate moves on them. There were pretty gross stories out of deployments in the Middle East in which intoxicated Vermont airmen touched women inappropriately, made inappropriate sexual advances. Um, so, yeah, I mean, there was the sort of pattern that I picked up was just a really hard partying culture, typified by the Afterburner Club, which was this sort of elite um, pilots hangout zone on the Guard campus, which is in the Burlington airport complex. And then that just spilled out in a lot of pretty despicable treatment towards women. And then again, you know, uh, Doris Sumner, who actually, you know, pushed through a lot of really pioneering national efforts to combat sexism. She herself had experienced pretty gross sexual harassment and assault during her military career, and also found that, you know, despite her best efforts to instill systems of accountability, the men in charge would elide them, would, you know, use the sort of buddy buddy system, the good old boys, you know, patronage system to sort of, um, you know, elide accountability, really.
So there is a straight line from that investigation and what you found there to the Virginia Military Academy, and the common thread is something you write at length about, which is this American masculine stereotype, and where military academies and military education have become sort of the foremost promoters of. And now we have Pete Hegseth, who embodies it. And you've been writing about Hegseth. So, since he is a figure who everybody has seen in his, on TV or wherever, talk about who he is, what he espouses, and what you think he represents.
Yeah, Pete Hegseth is a very interesting character, and really embodies many of the disparate themes that I explore in the book. I mean, the fact of the matter is that many young boys like Pete Hegseth come to feel at an early age that military service will provide them a certain, redemption or societal elevation, that it can, validate their own insecurities, or rather, dispatch with their insecurities, and validate their masculinity as true and right. And, like many boys, Pete Hegseth loved military parades, loved meeting veterans. He speaks in one of his memoirs about sort of this mythical Vietnam vet who counsels Hegseth never to miss his war. And, growing up in Minnesota, Hegseth felt some sense of shame around his father's own masculinity. He deemed it from an early age as insufficiently sort of aggressive, felt that his father didn't, stand up for himself, and sort of didn't contain some fighting spirit that was core to American manhood. And so, really, from those early days as a child, Hegseth has been chasing a lot of those things, um, and gets into West Point and Princeton, chooses Princeton, because he's very clear that not only does he want the sort of prestige that a military academy like West Point can confer, he also wants money. He says in his yearbook that, very explicitly, he hopes one day to be rolling in the Benjamins. And so he attends Princeton right around 9/11. He is involved in the ROTC program there, the Tiger Battalion. And really, from that age, from that moment, wraps himself in military service very explicitly. He is frequently seen around campus wearing his military uniform, even when he's not directly involved in ROTC activities. He writes frequently in a conservative campus magazine about the war, and, how his fellow Ivy Leaguers have by and large sort of, refused to engage or fight, that there's a sort of cowardly instinct among, American men today. He obviously positions himself as the inverse of that. And part of the sort of radicalism and rage that we see with Hegseth today stems from the fact that the sort of promised military identity that he hoped for never totally materialized, largely because the wars he fought in the places he went, Guantanamo Bay, Iraq, Afghanistan, fell out of favor with the American public. And so he returned home, and rather than being, reflexively greeted as a hero, he found a country that was really grappling with fundamental moral questions around these conflicts. And so,
Well, we should also add another important part of his bio and history is that he's been accused of sexual assault by a Republican um, staffer. He has admitted to paying $50,000 to settle a claim that she was raped, and there he has had been followed, dogged by a number of accusations of sexual assault, sexual harassment. So, just thought that's an important part of his bio as well.
absolutely. And it's interesting because in high school, friends described him as a bit boisterous and theatrical, but not a hard drinker at all. He also had a girlfriend. They were nominated as most likely to marry in the yearbook. They seem to have a pretty sweet relationship. She went to Barnard, one of the seven sisters. He visited her there. So it's interesting because I think his inculcation in military culture perhaps it didn't birth these sort of toxic instincts, but clearly there was some sort of transformation. And by the time he gets back from these deployments, he is drinking heavily, he is cheating on his wife, he is, pretty virulently anti-Islamophobic. And yes, he engages in an alleged pattern of sexual abuse. And, you know, part of the military identity to many people is a sort of implicit promise that women will, forever rely on your strength and be endlessly impressed by it. And so Hegseth enters a military where that paradigm is starting to shift, when women are being elevated for the first time really into senior roles where they are often outshining men in both physical and academic pursuits. And that is majorly threatening to people like Hegseth. And so often the response to that, the military response to that, is violent subjugation. And that is what we see with Hegseth as he is, struggling to form a healthy identity. And when he is sort of just like psychically hung up on all of these old school ideas around manliness and military service.
Well, he has become the source of a fantastic parody on Saturday Night Live with Colin Jost playing his part. And and so there is that. But it is to say that his version of masculinity and leadership generally has become cartoonish. And it's easy to lampoon him because it is like he is reaching for just a very old-fashioned kind of, 1950s-ish masculinity. And, of course, yes, he is both purging the military now of women and people of color. And those two go hand in hand. He is leading the attacks on trans people and trans service people, over the objections of military professionals. So it is just kind of part of this throwback, machismo. But this is something that you say the military education kind of goes hand in hand with this. Explain how that works, how the training that people get at these academies that are all over the country. And Vermont, of course, has Norwich, which is partly a military academy, partly a civilian as well. So, talk about the connection between all these things.
Ever since military education was pioneered in the early days of this country with West Point, there has been this very enticing promise that military education and military service writ large can sort of straighten out and reform the defects of American boys and men. I mean, it's kind of been sold as this panacea, uh, class valedictorians around the world, around the country, excuse me, venture to West Point because of its promise of academic excellence. It's seen as a place to build soldier scholars that supports academic brilliance. At the same time, Lost Boys enter another sort of category of sort of reform style military schools in which, often the public school system is deemed, unable to sort of reform issues. And so military school is prescribed. The fact of the matter, though, is that the curriculum, the pedagogy, the structure, the rigid structure of campus life often produces, deep pain, trauma, resentment, cynicism. It can be very destructive, and that is evident by looking at the many struggles of veterans today. I mean, military service, I should also say, has the highest divorce rate of any profession. Serious drug and alcohol abuse, incarceration rates have spiked for veterans after virtually every single American conflict. So has domestic extremism. You can trace spikes in KKK membership over American history with the end of American conflict. There is intense blowback here. And so the idea that, the military is the sort of single and most effective reform program for boys is just completely untrue. It often just leaves them more damaged. There are certain elements of military structure that can be beneficial. Some people really do enjoy the sort of rigid on-campus system and the rules. I think also, many people who serve develop real love, kinship, camaraderie with the people they serve and are able to sort of, because they're in a hyper masculine environment, there's a certain permission structure sometimes to actually express be vulnerable and loving in a way that often feels more tricky in a civilian context. But, the fact of the matter is that since the 1800s, there are many stories of mostly young boys who have been deeply damaged while under the care of military school officials. Some have died, some have committed suicide, some have been hospitalized for psychiatric crises. The book is really arguing that, there is a long and relatively dark history here, and that alternative ideas around shaping American masculinity and aiding American men should be considered and deployed.
In your reporting for this book, one of the stories that you recount is trying to report on West Point, being repeatedly turned down, and finally showing up there when President Trump was delivering a commencement address, which was followed by by the Secret Service making inquiries about you. So tell us that story and start with what it's been like for you to try to report on West Point, probably the most iconic military education institution.
Yeah, well, during the Biden administration, I was able to get some access to West Point. Um, a few of my sources took me on campus as a guest. And, I mean, I've spoken to countless folks who've worked and attended the school over the years, but the place itself um, is is fascinating. I mean, it's gorgeous right on the Hudson River, but there's certainly like a coldness that's sort of that you can feel on campus. Lots of stone buildings and sort of craggy trees, um, and then just uh, scores of cadets walking very, distinctly in a row. Harper's once sort of described the place as, a collection of tin soldiers all stamped from the same base metal. And so I was able to get some sense of the culture during the Biden administration, but even so, West Point's press folks were never really happy to deal with me. And I was writing in the early months of the Trump administration about Pete Hegseth's purging of civilian staff and of liberal arts courses from campus for Politico. I tried to cover that speech. My credentials were denied at the last minute, but I decided I might as well drive up from New York and get a sense of the scene. There was going to be some protest, and so I basically just hung out at the protest, talked to some people there, went home, wrote the story, no big deal. A week later, I'm actually driving up to Vermont, to the Northeast Kingdom, to see my folks. And my brother calls me in the car and says, "There's a Secret Service agent here looking to speak with you." I decide to talk to him on the phone, and he alerts me to the fact that West Point referred me to the Secret Service, alleging without merit, completely falsely, that I was acting suspiciously on campus and that I had been asking around to meet the president, which, again, not true. Though, if I had been doing that, certainly well within my rights as a journalist. Um, and, I mean, the Secret Service, they obviously had figured out where my folks live. They had the plate number of the car I was driving. I mean, they knew what was up, and they were trying to understand where I was currently living in Brooklyn. I had just moved and had not yet, I guess, had those records show up in their database. So yeah, I mean, it was a pretty clear cut act of intimidation from West Point. I must say, the Secret Service agent who was based in the Burlington office was incredibly professional and was actually pretty blunt that he found this entire thing to be inappropriate. I was told by my brother that he actually, because he met him in person, I never did, but that he sort of cut the figure of like a crunchier Secret Service agent, very Vermont. I think he had like Merrill boots on or something. But yeah, my belief is that agent from Burlington, did his best to close the case and was successful at doing so, and I'm grateful to him for that. But yeah, I mean, covering the institution is really hard. Um, the West Point alumni are sort of their own secretive society. They sometimes go by ring knockers on account of the class rings. They slam on tables when they're highly inebriated to sort of show off their status. Sometimes they're called the West Point Protective Association. So, already I've faced blowback from that world because of my critical reporting. But so far it's been manageable.
What do you hope will come of your latest book? And also explain the title, God Forgives, Brothers Don't.
Yes. Well, God Forgives, Brothers Don't, I think perfectly encapsulates the sort of punishing dynamics at these schools and um, speaks to the fact that, you know, often the brotherhood that many men are seeking through military service never fully comes to fruition because they're sort of um, operating in a larger institution that will forever withhold sort of like full validation, in which sort of any interpersonal bonds are often de-emphasized for the sort of hard military mission um, in front of you. But this was long the West Point football team motto, adopted in 1996, printed by West Point on official merchandise. Some players got tattoos reading God Forgives, Brothers Don't. Others got rings with the motto. But curiously, about a decade and a half before this occurred, God Forgives, Brothers Don't was established as the Omerta Code of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, one of the most violent and vicious prison gangs in American history. And um, it's not entirely clear what, if anything, West Point football knew about the motto's provenance upon its adoption, though there is some evidence that players watched a movie called Stone Cold about an Aryan Brotherhood biker gang, loosely inspired by the real brothers, and heard that those words and saw some found some kinship with that culture and with that motto.
Finally, Jasper, tell us what's next for you. I understand a return to Vermont is in the works.
Yes, yes. I have been in New York for about 8 years now. Um, but have really missed Vermont. And late last year, my girlfriend and I found a house in Barnet, just a few miles from where I grew up in the Northeast Kingdom. And so once she finishes graduate school, I will be moving back full time and hopefully trying, finding some role in Vermont media. And I'm very excited about it.
Well, it'll be good to have you back, though it seems you've never left as well. Well, congratulations on the new book, God Forgives, Brothers Don't. And I look forward to talking with you again, I'm sure, about future investigations that you undertake.
Thanks so much, David.
Jasper Craven is a freelance reporter covering the military and veterans issues. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, Politico, and Mother Jones, among other publications. His new book is God Forgives, Brothers Don't: The Long March of Military Education and the Making of American Manhood. That does it for this week's Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Thanks so much for listening.